Welcome to the Council as a Whole workshop discussion. Today is December, 18th, isn't it?
It is. Yes.
We are here to discuss, review the ordinance numbers 059, 2024 and 060, 2024, which one deals with a medical dispensary and one deals with a recreational dispensary of marijuana. In respect to the committee, we will let Mr. Schilling, since he is the committee chair of Community and Economic Development, start it off with his views or whatever you would like to say.
Okay, appreciate it, Mr. President. Again, thanks for everybody for coming tonight. And again, one of the reasons that we called this meeting was 2 weeks ago we had a committee meeting on this, and at the end of the meeting we had some very good discussions, and at the end of the meeting it was the majority report was to have included a recommendation for one dispensary, and in talking with Mr. Kerber, there was some confusion there whether my understanding was that the dispensary would have the ability to dispense either recreational or medical, but it was all going to come out of one dispensary. And the way the legislation was written, we could end up with two dispensaries in the B4 zoning district, and that was not what the intent of the committee was. And I think Mr. Sneak could probably help me out on that.
Okay.
That was pretty much your understanding of what we.
If you're finished,
yeah, I think if that's the reasoning we're here, is to try to get this straightened out.
I would just add that and refer back to my statement from the committee meeting where I clearly said that I could support the location of one adult cannabis operator within the B4 zoning district. There was discussion that you could have a license for medical dispensing, recreational, or both. If you had medical, you could also have recreational. I don't know if there is a legal requirement one for the other, but my statement was clear that I could only support one dispensary, but it didn't matter what type of license sure that it had. I was clear that it would not be cultivators, processors, and I did not want it in the downtown, near the downtown business district, which was why the B4 was mentioned. So that's what was my intent at the committee meeting. It remains my intent.
Mr. President.
Yes, sir.
And I did have a couple, in talking to Mr. Kerber over this, there was some question as how legislation could be constructed to allow one dispensary, and then do we have the ability to determine in that legislation whether or not whether that dispensary would have the ability to provide both recreational and medical, or is that sort of just open? I mean, as we say, one dispensary can offer cannabis in the B4 area, and then it's up to the cannabis operator to make a determination whether they're going to sell medical and or recreational, or how. I mean, is there some problem with writing a legislation that would reflect what we're trying to do here?
Can we determine the licensing or distinction, or is that solely to the state?
Well, the state ultimately is the one that regulates these. I mean, and there's no question, and even within the legislation, both under the medical and the adult use, that the controlling boards are supposed to review this to make determinations whether or not to issue additional licensing or change some of the rules that apply to those. So those things are definitely subject to change, and those are subject to change pursuant to the state making those changes. Now, as far as the legislation that has been presented and that is in front of the council at this point in time, I based those off the committee report, and the committee report said either a medical or a adult use, and those are the two in front of you. If council chooses to go with the medical, it would approve that one. As far as putting it, it could be one or the other.
Or both.
Or both, well, and that's, and I guess I would want more clarification when you say both.
Well, in other words, can we say that we want a dispensary that would offer, have the ability to offer both medical and recreational cannabis?
Well, I suppose that you could. The difficulty would be there is no assurances that the state would permit one to do both,
Well,
because that's subject to
Good
the
question.
state law on that.
Mrs. Sneak?
so I guess that leads to a question, because I thought we had information at one point that those licensees that held a medical license were the first people who were going to have the ability to get recreational licenses, and therefore they would be holding both. Is that correct? I mean, I feel like there's been a lot of misunderstanding around terms used, operators and dispensaries and things, and then some of that confusion has led to some of maybe the way things have been written or expressed.
Well, what, Mrs. Snee, what the law passed by initiative, what it stated that if you had a valid medical license at the time of enactment of Chapter 3780, then you get the preference on the adult use. It doesn't mean anything. There is no provisions to say if somebody gets a medical now, that automatically flips into an adult use.
I can understand the not being automatic. I just thought that they would have the first.
But that is all subject to change as well, and that would not be dictated by the city whatsoever. That would all be dictated by the state.
Well, and the only thing I will add is this whole discussion only started because of having to make a decision about adult use or recreational, and I'm assuming that those two terms can be used interchangeably. And so the only reason that medical came up at our committee discussion was the fact that we had made a decision several years ago about that, which would have required a change, we thought, to the code if we said you could have a dispensary in Troy.
For the medical, yes.
And that's the only reason that a discussion about medical use came up. The entire discussion was driven by the initiative and the approval of recreational use and whether that was going to have to be revisited here in Troy. And when we revisited it, we said that we could have one, that we would think that having one dispensary in the B4, I mean, as I said, that's all I could support. And I just don't remember being at all explicit about one medical, one recreational.
Well, and I just base it off of the committee report that was presented, and that's how I base that. And it's my understanding that committee members get an opportunity to review that before it's read at the council. And it clearly stated that medical or adult use, and that's
But-
what's being placed in front of the.
Prior to stating that word "or," which that's a very powerful two-letter word, but prior to stating to that twice, it said the committee recommends that legislation be prepared to permit the location of one adult cannabis operator within the B4 zoning district. And then that provided that council can set the number of permitted operators at one.
Well,
So,
you know, we can talk about how we got here, and ultimately, this is a committee of the whole. If there's a recommendation that new legislation be presented to council, if the committee, a majority of this committee recommends it, there'll be a new committee report. I'll prepare the legislation in whichever way the direction that I'm given within that report.
Can I speak to that, Mr. Roselle?
Yes, Mr. Siebert.
It is my understanding that this is a committee of the whole, and I've been relatively silent through all the machinations of this particular legislation. But if you will recall, probably now 6 or 8 weeks ago, my concern was the constitutionality of a total ban, which was what the Planning Commission was recommended. Since that time, Mr. Kerber has rendered a legal opinion that says a total ban would be constitutional for our community. As we sit here today, marijuana is still a Schedule I federal offense substance. Banks cannot fund dispensaries for fear of money laundering. There were 151 criminal robberies of dispensaries in the state of California last year based on product and based upon the accumulation of cash because there's no depository for the cash. I feel there are still societal issues with marijuana. I've spent an inordinate amount of time looking through various law review articles today. The legislator has had several bills to amend issue 2 since it was approved in November 2023, adopted December 3rd of 2023. Basically, there are 2 dispensaries within a 7-mile radius of where we sit right now. I heard Mr. Behringer come and talk about you're going against the will of the people. I perceive the will of the people that we didn't want to incarcerate individuals for minimum amounts of marijuana. I believe that we wanted to have marijuana accessible through self-grow facilities, which were all contained in that statute. I think we didn't want to use police resources tracking down minimal marijuana uses, and I think that's why the majority of the people voted for that. As we sat here today, I literally just spoke to a friend of mine at 5:30 from Columbus. He's on a travel hockey team. I asked him what he thought about this. He indicated that they travel all over, and if they pull into a hotel that has a dispensary, that they move on to the next city. And that's how he perceived it. I just don't believe that this is something that we want in the city of Troy right now. And I believe that we should do a total ban, and we can review it in a few years after all of this gets sort of, run through the mill and we see where people want. So my recommendation as a member of the whole of the committee is that we do a total ban and that we, we can review it. And if we ever get to the stage that there is a legitimate applicant that can be reviewed, or we can review it once we know more what the legislature is going to do to the bill, and once we know more how it's going to affect societal issues. So that's my position.
Mr. Twist.
Ditto what Todd said. I would be in agreement. But I just think we said no to the medical and really haven't had a lot of feedback back to add that. So why would we add a recreational at this time? I just think overall we have the freedom with how it's set up to have a total ban, and so I would be in agreement with that. And down the road, we can go from there.
Mr. Rozo?
Mrs. Snee.
If I can add, just speaking to specifically what we are addressing tonight, which is these 2 ordinances, because of the way they're written and the intent I expressed at the committee meeting, I can't support either of these ordinances because I don't feel like that is the way that I expected things to be set up. So revisiting in the future, whenever that might be, would be fine, but I cannot support either of these ordinances.
Because each of these,
because of how they're
'Cause
set up individually.
because each of those could be in B4.
Right.
Mr. Pierce?
I would support a total ban at this time as well, continuing on with what the planning committee has recommended, or planning commission has recommended, due to the societal cost that we're looking at for this. I understand what we've been talking about, the different viewpoints of different council members. I've been able to reach out to the community and have received diverse opinions on this as well too. I've listened to I've read the reports from our different officials and see that it'd be something that would negatively impact our community. It's a standard that Troy is the county seat, and as such, we have a certain responsibility. It has certain benefits, financial benefits, as being the county seat, but it also carries with it certain responsibilities. So I would ask the rest of you guys to join me in banning this in our city as well, as far as the dispensaries go.
Mr. Whidden, any comments?
You know, I think it's a close run issue. I think we've heard from a lot of people, and I feel strongly that both sides have good arguments on it. My take on this is because it's so close that we need to follow the rule or follow what the voters said when it's this close. Elections have consequences. They said they wanted recreational marijuana. My opinion is that it was passed in the city, it passed in the first ward. I'm going to stick with the voters. If they say they want recreational marijuana, I would be in favor of that. So that's where I stand.
Mrs. Westfall?
And this is, I've gone back and forth. I have been a nurse for a really long time, but I have seen medical marijuana help a lot of people with pain management, and I would be in favor of that. But because this is convoluted to some degree and difficult to differentiate the two, and I feel strongly that because it's federally still illegal, I have a problem with that. I would have been in favor of one dispensary because of the medical use, but I realize there are problems with both, and I feel like there's a greater problem with alcohol, 100 times, 1,000 times more than medical marijuana will ever be. So I'm torn, and I would vote in favor of one dispensary, because I do believe our voters mean something also, just like Mr. Whidden said. Although it's a very difficult decision to make and not made easily.
Mrs. Marshall?
I am very torn between both sides. I take what everybody said to heart very seriously, and at one point I was on one side of it, and then I went to the other side, and then I'm back and forth, and not because I'm wishy-washy, it's because I am trying to take into consideration how everybody truly feels and, you know, their feelings and their opinions, and it is very hard for me to make that judgment call for everybody, because I'm not your parent. What you do in your own home is up to you. I have talked to many, many people about, you know, how they feel about it, and I was hoping that I would get clarity, that there would be a huge landslide of either for or against, and it would make my decision a lot easier. And unfortunately, that did not happen. And so I really honestly am still very torn on the issue. I have to think about it personally for my family, since I don't feel like it was very clear, I don't want to add any more stress and pressure to my family who are police officers, and their safety is a concern of mine as well as the citizens' safety. I'm willing to revisit it and talk about it at length, but I wouldn't know what to say right now, to be honest, if I had to vote.
Thank you. Mr. Schilling, you have closing comments or?
Yes, I
additional
do.
comments?
I think, again, as I said before, that the problem with drugs in our society is one of demand, not supply. If we did not have a demand for drugs, nobody would be selling it. We wouldn't need a dispensary. We wouldn't have drug dealers on the corners in the neighborhoods. But for some reason, we have a tremendous demand for drugs in the United States. Here in Troy, you know, if you want a specific drug, you can buy it in the city of Troy. You know, there was obviously some concerns about our children in the high school and junior high school and elementary schools having access to cannabis. And again, as I said before, they're not buying this from the dispensaries up in Piqua. You know, they're getting it from their friends and willing adults and drug dealers that are on the corners here in Troy, buying it in Troy. And that's not going to change. Okay, that's not going to change. It's not going to change until we figure out how to reduce the demand. And we're not doing a very good job of that now as a country. Since 2019, $2.1 billion of cannabis sales has gone through the state instead of being done on the street corners in the state of Ohio. $2.1 billion. That's a lot of money to take off the street and put it into a regulated environment, and this is one of the things that dispensaries do. The dispensary provides, as the only supply, the cannabis supplied by these dispensaries is the only supply of cannabis that is tested and regulated. Again, your local street dealer here in Troy has no idea of what they're offering for sale. And so that the only way that, the little safety that is provided through the cannabis is purchased in dispensaries. And again, if we, you know, and the question to everybody is that if we ban dispensaries in the city of Troy, that only leaves one option left for those that don't want to travel to Piqua or someplace else, and that's to buy it off the streets. And again, said nobody's having a problem buying cannabis off the streets in the city of Troy. And again, obviously the voters voted to regulate cannabis. And I think, in my own mind, I would like to see this, again, I would like to see us formulate legislation so that it can be taken to referendum, and that, again, let the voters in the city of Troy decide if this is what they want. But again, we can't, if we don't formulate, if we just say, well, we're banning recreational marijuana distributors in the city of Troy, then you know, then if it goes to referendum, we have no idea what's going to come out of that. You know, it could be something that maybe more than what we're looking at right now. And so I would think that there'd be a responsibility of city council to formulate some type of a bill to, you know, so that it could be referendum, but the decision, whichever decision the voters make, would then be acceptable. You know, whichever way it goes. And so that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see tonight our committee work on, you know, present some type of legislation, or ask for some type of legislation that we can, if we vote it down next week, that's fine. voted down in 2 weeks, that's fine, the 5th of January. But we need to make a vote on this so that it can go to referendum and essentially let the voters decide on this thing. I think that the issue is very evenly split in the city of Troy, from what we've heard. And again, this is I think it's the responsibility of the council to get a piece of legislation that can be looked at, and if it needs to be referendum, that it can happen.
Mr. Chair, if I can ask for some clarification?
Yeah, I think I'd like a few clarifications. Why would you want to pass a piece of legislation to be referendum?
Because I think it's up to the, I think we need to leave this up to the citizens to do this. I think that if whichever side we come down on, you're going to have half the people are not going to be happy with that.
That's where we're at.
Right, and so that let the voters decide. In other words, you know, again, it passed on the ability to have make recreational use of marijuana legal in the state of Ohio, you know, passed by a majority vote. And again, I think that we would, in the city of Troy, if that means that okay, if the voters passed to have you know, legal use of recreational marijuana, then does that also mean that we have a distributor or a dispensary in Troy? And so that what we want to come up with is okay, if we decide one way, the voters can take that to referendum and decide something else they so choose.
Can I have a
Mrs.
point of
Snead.
clarification? I just want to clarify. We have a recommendation from the Planning Commission in front of us. Our committee met on that, and we have the legislation that has been presented based on our committee recommendation. If this legislation isn't approved by 3/4 of council, 7 votes, and fails, does that Planning Commission recommendation remain in front of us to be discussed again, or what is the next step?
No, that planning commission, once you act upon it, that recommendation is done.
Okay.
If it doesn't pass by 3/4, the process would have to start over again.
So through the amendments that
So-
we got split out in 59 and 60, that did away with the Planning Commission recommendation.
No,
Well,
it's
No,
not.
only if it's voted on.
Yeah.
Only if it's voted on.
My understanding, Mr. Gerber, and you can correct me if this is wrong, but this was a subsequent committee of the whole to review the legislation. So the way I believe I heard it, there are 4, the majority vote would be for a ban. The minority report would be for the legislation that was drafted. There hasn't been any proposed amended legislation, and I believe we have 1 non-committal and 1 absent. So the way I count the votes is it's 4 for a ban, 3 and a minority report for a dispensary, and 1 that was non-committal. Is this the way we're operating? Is this new committee, or is this just to talk? I mean, because I don't know how we can talk about a prior committee's report as a committee of a whole.
Well, first off, I'm not going to be counting heads because people didn't use the exact same terms. So I'm, you know, as far as the numbers on things, but this committee can certainly make a recommendation for legislation, and what you have promoted, as my understanding, is a ban. And if this committee makes that recommendation that there would be a ban on dispensaries and cultivators and processors, I would prepare that legislation for the next meeting.
Can we?
But how do you dispose of the
3 we
2
have.
ordinances that are on here?
What I
Those
would
be-
suggest is that if this is the committee's recommendation, that those ordinances, there'd be a motion to postpone indefinitely both of those at the next council meeting.
Can we include in the language of the ban that it can be reviewed in a few years?
Well, certainly, yeah, I mean, the zoning code can always be reviewed, and there can be requests of the planning commission to look at it again, or to have that presented. There's no question that could be part of it.
And just a further clarification, one of my concerns had been, that I stated at the committee meeting, was that really one of the most important considerations that I had was that our zoning code be specific in identifying this as a business, because there had been a concern raised that if we didn't specifically define an adult use cannabis operator, whether we're banning it or whatever, that it could be interpreted as just a retail business in any of the zoning classifications that allow retail businesses. So would this proposed, if we talk about proposed legislation that would say it's banning, would that also include just simply defining this business or this type of business?
Yes, it would.
And then it would have the...
I would identify it as, the legislation would use the same definition that the state law has. So it's anything licensed under those would be banned, if that's the committee's choice.
So if that's, so as the zoning administrator, Mr. Chair, by defining that, what you're saying is that I would not, and I do not want, but I would not have the, interpretation of a like business such as tobacco, because it's specifically defined in your legislation to be distinct from tobacco retail.
That would take the discretion away from the zoning administrator if there was a clear ban on that.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Are you proposing?
So, is that, so I thought I already did, but so I would move then that this committee recommends to council a adoption of the planning commission and a total ban, and if we can put some language of subject to review at some time, I would like to see how it all works its way out in the future, but right now I'm for a total ban.
Okay, and just to clarify with your motion, Mr. Siebert, is that on dispensaries, cultivators, and processors?
Correct.
Okay.
We don't make motions in committee meetings.
Well, that's what I was just advised by the law what got to do.
I mean, we ask for preferences.
I would ask for a committee.
We ask for preferences, and we can file either a majority or minority report, but we do not subject motions or votes in committee meetings.
That's probably fair.
You can agree or disagree with
Yeah,
what's stated.
I guess I would propose a majority report on the ban based upon 4 majority members here.
And that would also include keeping in place the medical ban that's in place?
Correct.
Okay.
As well as postponing indefinitely the 2 pieces that are on.
Correct.
And then do they have to have a minority report of something?
Well,
It'd probably be all the same report, I would assume.
It may be 4 to
Wouldn't it?
4. There's still 4 people that support this thing.
Well, I don't know what thing we're saying we're supporting, because we have different things out there. I mean, I stated I can't support either of these ordinances. I stand by my original ability to support one dispensary only, but I'm not seeing that that's going to be something that will get the support that it needs of a supermajority of council.
Right, no, I think, but I mean, coming out of the committee, I mean, we could, I myself would support one dispensary. And I say, I don't support that's why we're here talking about the current legislation before us, because I don't support either one of those. But I obviously do support,
Okay, but what you've got here
I think we
is 4 people saying they're not going to support one dispensary.
and there are 8 people here.
True.
You need 6 to say yes.
7.
7 to say yes.
Yes.
at council.
At the council meeting.
Need 7 to say
Because
yes
it's,
on the amendment.
you're trying to
and 5
override
to
what
say
the
PC
planning commission said.
No,
so you need a
we're
3/4.
discussing tonight the legislation in front of us. And I
We
think
have-
that,
Which it-
we have enough people saying that we don't want that.
Which is a
those
reason.
two, or those two ordinances
Correct.
to go any further.
Is this a correct
Postpone.
statement, Mr. Kerber? These two that we're discussing tonight is a direct result of them not like, the committee recommendation of not accepting the planning commission's recommendation and trying to draft something different.
That is correct. So ultimately, if council votes on anything that differs from the planning commission's recommendation of a total ban, you're going to need 7 votes in the affirmative on whatever is different.
At council, not at committee.
Council.
True.
Yes,
I
that's
think-
correct. That's correct.
can we
I
go-
think our understanding tonight is that
We're
seeing
postponing.
clearly that neither of these is going to pass with 7 votes at a council meeting, do we need a different type of legislation that Mr. Sievert has proposed? Because in my mind, we have to be clear on how we're defining this type of business and what decision we're making. We may not all agree individually with that decision, but as council, we have to define that business and make a decision and not leave our zoning code subject to interpretation.
So if we
Mr. Kerber,
post-
that would require 5 votes, is that correct? To adopt?
If it's in concurrence with the planning commission's recommendation, you only need 5 votes. But if it's not in concurrence with the planning commission recommendation, you need 7 votes.
So if we postpone these two,
Indefinitely.
it dies.
Correct.
But we then vote on what the original commission provided us?
If that's the will of the committee, yes.
Okay, so we would have to bring back what the commission.
But what Todd wants to do is add to
I want
the planning commission's
to, yeah,
recommendation.
can I not do that for the next meeting, or you can't have competing pieces of legislation?
No, you
Always
can.
what
I
we're
mean,
saying, different.
because the 2 existing ordinances have to be dealt with in one way or the other at the next council meeting. So if there was a recommendation that new legislation, I mean, there's 2 different ways that you could do this, but I'm suggesting the most, what I see to be the most logical way to do it is have if it's the committee's will to do this, is to have a recommendation that new legislation be prepared consistent with what you've just described, and that legislation would then appear on the agenda at the next council meeting. So there would be 3 items on the agenda. If it was the will of council to go as you proposed, the 2 existing pieces of legislation allowing for the dispensaries, the medical and the adult use and the B4, it would be appropriate for council to, for an individual council member to make a motion second to postpone it indefinitely, those 2 pieces of legislation, and that would effectively kill the existing legislation, and then there would be a vote on your proposal this evening.
Doesn't that proposal have to go back through committee?
This is a
This
committee.
is the committee as a whole. It got pushed to the committee as a whole.
Okay.
Okay, clear as mud.
Muff on the mud.
So do we need to determine who's going to be on a majority report and a minority report? Or do we not need to do that?
I think we need to do that. We do that with every other committee report.
What majority you've got.
Okay,
Can
so,
we have it
Restate
restated?
So-
restate what you want to do, and we'll go from there.
I guess I can't move
What-
it. I would propose that there is a report of this committee of the whole to adopt new legislation that would incorporate the planning commission's total ban at this time.
But you want,
And postpone indefinitely the 2 existing.
Well, I think we need 2 votes on that. I think we need one consideration on the current legislation, whether to,
you're gonna,
to do that, and then take up your motion to ban as a second look at.
Oh, no, Grant, I would think you could.
You're
do
not,
that.
because you're
I
gonna.
mean, again,
You're-
we're combining things, and it's gotta be, we have to make decisions on each one. And I think
And the
it'd be better to
deci-
have them separate.
Individually,
I think
the
if somebody
next,
proposes to postpone indefinitely the council meeting, that's a whole different issue. We're only talking about proposing
Right.
new legislation.
That's correct.
okay.
So I think we, I think the first,
legislation of a.
the first thing we'd want to do is to say, okay, the legislation before us is not acceptable. And that we want this,
Well, I don't know
Why?
that that's right. There's
Pardon?
no reason to do that. That can be
You'll do that at the
done
next
down the
meeting.
road, right.
the
I
committee
think,
still has to make a decision on that.
No,
No, it doesn't.
no, we don't. It's
So then the only
already
thing
on
we're
our
gonna,
agenda.
the only
It's already been corrected.
decision we're gonna make is whether or not to, accept the,
total ban.
Under the,
planning commission's ban on.
under the
on
scenario
marijuana.
that Grant just described, you're gonna go to the council meeting, given everybody agrees, or most agree, you're gonna indefinitely suspend 059 and 060. And then whatever Todd's proposing tonight, if that becomes legislation for Monday, or the next Monday we meet, you'll be voting on that. That eliminates these two items here and goes back to whatever he's proposing.
So we need to make two declarations.
Not
One-
tonight. Because you're gonna declare these two at the council meeting.
This is a report, you can include both of those.
You can, but I mean,
What Mr. Sievert said, since it's not an official motion, you might have approved there, Mr. Schilling, if it was.
Well, in other words, how do we get a
separate
minority
motion.
and majority report out of this committee?
it will be read in the committee report, will it not? That
The summary.
Which is
four
why-
of them did, or five of them
why
did,
we're
and
including
three didn't, or
your suggestion
whatever we
in
got.
proposal.
I mean,
You haven't asked us
Which is why, right,
to respond to it.
right. That's what I asked.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. So I think I have a motion, or I think I have a. Legislation on the floor, and then we need to see if there's a minority or majority report. Is that correct, Mr. Kerber?
Yes.
Okay, so obviously I would be in support of that.
You can do the survey around the committee then.
I can.
Sure.
So we got your wording out,
I
all
think-
inclusive that you want in.
Mr. Kerber, do you understand?
Well, let me just state what I understand it to be, so there's no, my understanding is that you want legislation prepared that's consistent with the Planning Commission recommendation, which would be a prohibition on the establishment of any sort of adult use cultivators, dispensaries, or processors, and how the Ohio, and I'll just make it clear, the Ohio Revised Code, they define all three of those as operators, okay? So you're suggesting all of those be banned. There'd be no legislation to keep the medical, because that's already existing, and that's my understanding of what you're proposing.
That's correct.
All right.
And Lynn, you got all the wording you want in? As
I-
opposed to the
I'm
definition of-
loath to suggest any wording at this point.
I mean, you want your definition of that business? If we're,
Well, I think that will.
That's what he
That
means.
will
Okay,
define the
okay,
adult
okay.
cannabis business. That had been my,
You want the language about review?
Can we put in language that it would be reviewed and?
Well, and you know,
You
you can
can- that'll just
encourage,
happen automatically,
yeah, I
right?
mean, it would
Okay.
come in front of the Planning Commission, and it would be more of a, you know, a request that it be looked at and within a certain period of time frame. You could do that. But that, again, that doesn't prevent, you know, it could come up in 6 months.
I think we're okay with your language, Mr.
Mhm.
Kerber.
Nothing about coming back.
are you now asking us
Yeah,
all
sure.
what we're doing?
Yeah.
just your opinion of, or, I
Well,
can't ask for any vote.
You know, I mean, we had a lengthy discussion about this at the Community and Economic Development Committee. I said then it was a nuanced issue. We have heard from people on both sides. It has been, as many people have stated, very evenly split, and I stated at that committee meeting that the only thing I could support was one dispensary in the B4 district. Although I am still willing to say at some future time I would support that, with the way our legislation stands, from what this committee is talking about, I can support what this committee is proposing because I cannot support legislation that would potentially create two dispensaries. So I'm willing to be a part of the majority report on this because that is what I anticipate will happen at council, is that these two pieces of legislation, which I've said I can't support them separately, won't be approved, and then we need something in its place. So since my primary concern is having it defined and not being unclear in the zoning code, I can support the legislation as proposed.
Mr. Titterton.
I just want to make sure the record reflects, that you're talking about.
Mr. Sievers.
A ban. Okay.
Yes.
Mrs. Westfall.
And I feel the same way. We're not going to have a super majority anyway, and because it wasn't clear, I would support the ban.
Mr. Schilling?
Again, I can't support the legislation as it was written, but I think that we need to take a look at this, having one dispensary as an option, and so therefore I can't support the ban.
Mrs. Marshall.
I would agree with everybody who has just spoken. I couldn't say it better. I would agree with the ban.
Mr. Whidden.
Again, I think it's a very close run thing. I think we've seen some strong proponents on both sides. They're here in the audience tonight. We've heard through email, this chatter I've received over the last couple of weeks. It's a close issue. My fallback position again is the voters have spoken. I know they don't always go whether it's good or bad. I think the voters have spoken, and that is a safe place for democracy to stand on, in my opinion. And so I would be against the ban because of that.
I support the ban.
Support the ban.
So our next move is?
Well, you prepare
Well, we'll have a committee report prepared.
Okay.
Consistent with what was discussed this evening, and I will prepare legislation that will, the first meeting in January will be present. It will be numbered after, it'll be on the agenda after the other two items. Okay. So there'd be some, and given that all three of those items are inconsistent with one another, it certainly is my opinion that, you can't have approval on one or more than one. So and I would suggest the process to use would be the procedural motion of a motion to postpone indefinitely.
Okay.
Can, Ms. Rizzo?
Yes,
one more
ma'am.
question. Does postponing indefinitely take a supermajority also?
No, it's
No,
a simple
just a simple
majority.
majority. Thank you.
I'll get some flack for this. However, in all due respect for you, the people that came, you can come and make your comments. My request is if we've heard from you on Monday or if we've sent email in, please keep those comments brief since everybody has been notified of your views. And anybody that hasn't spoken on Monday that would like to speak or wants to speak again today, the 2-minute limit will be strictly enforced tonight.
I'll break the silence. Steve Henderson. One of the things that I find a little confusing among, which I think puts me in good company, is the committee asked for legislation. For some reason or another, there's a miscommunication so that the legislation that you wanted didn't come out. So now you got two pieces of legislation that nobody on the committee wanted. So it seems to me that the logical thing would be to go say, oops, there was a miscommunication. we would like to have the committee meet with whoever they got to, or go to church or wherever else you gotta go, and figure out a way to say, okay, we want legislation that allows a mixed-use dispensary and a medical marijuana. That way, I think that's what the committee wanted to begin with, and that's not what they got. So we're spending a whole night talking about something that really shouldn't have happened, in my opinion. Thanks for your time.
Grant, is it, and we can't determine who gets the license, whether, if somebody asks for a license, the way it's written and the way they're objecting, because it had to be two pieces of legislation due to, it's two separate codes in the revised code, correct?
Well,
One's medical, and one's recreational, there's two different codes.
If the city allowed, and put a limit on those, it would be whoever files the zoning application first.
Yeah, but there's,
He's saying it's set.
there's two separate codes at the state level, right?
Yeah, there's two, oh, yes.
That's
yeah.
why
Yes.
the or got broken out into two pieces of legislation, which
Thank you.
nobody
I didn't understand
liked,
That's why
if that makes any sense.
there's two separate licenses within.
That's correct, yeah.
Anyone else? All right. Thank you very much for attendance. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for your input.